What if the collapse of America wasn't an accident? What if it was a blueprint? You've heard the headlines. The crushing cost of living, a national debt spiraling past $35 trillion, dollars, a housing market in freefall. We are told these are the problems, but they are not. These are not the disease, they are the symptoms. The real story, the one happening behind the closed doors of state capitals and corporate boardrooms, is far more unsettling. It's a story of intentional decisions, of systemic failures, and of policies that have quietly engineered the decline we see today. This is not a story about what is happening. This is a story about why it's happening. Today, we are not just listing the states that are falling apart. We are exposing the hidden architects of their collapse. We are revealing the blueprint. Stay with us as we count down the 10 states unraveling the fastest and uncover the root causes that are pushing them over the edge. Number 10, Oregon. The story of Oregon was supposed to be different. It was sold as a haven of green forests, craft breweries, and forward-thinking ideals. But today, that dream is a nightmare. In just 5 years, the state has hemorrhaged over 70,000 residents. This isn't a slow leak. It's a full-scale evacuation. In Portland, once the hipster capital of the nation, the median home price stands at a suffocating $510,000, while the average household struggles with just $82,000 a year. Families are trapped in a financial death grip. Jobs are disappearing as corporate giants like Nike and Intel cut back, and downtown businesses are boarded up. Crime, homelessness, and open-air drug markets have become the new normal, forcing retailers like Walmart and REI to flee entirely. This isn't the Oregon Trail anymore. This is Oregon on fire. But this collapse was not inevitable. It was engineered by two critical policy failures. First, the state's controversial drug decriminalization law, Measure 1 and 10. While intended to treat addiction as a health issue, the policy was rolled out without the necessary infrastructure for treatment and support. This created a vacuum. It inadvertently turned cities like Portland into magnets for the drug trade, fueling a public health crisis that sent crime rates soaring and made the streets feel unsafe. Businesses found themselves unable to operate amidst the chaos, and the resulting exodus of retail was a predictable consequence of a well-intentioned policy that lacked a real-world execution plan. The second architect of this failure is Oregon's rigid land use policy, known as the urban growth boundary. For decades, this law has severely restricted the supply of new housing in the name of preventing urban sprawl. The result? A chronic housing shortage that has sent prices into the stratosphere, far beyond the reach of ordinary working families. It created a state where the cost of entry became a wall, pricing out the very people needed to sustain its economy. Oregon's decline is a textbook case of progressive ideals colliding with pragmatic reality, creating a nightmare of their own design. Number 9, Maryland. Maryland, once considered the crown jewel of the Mid-Atlantic, is quietly bleeding out. Between 2020 and 2024, the state witnessed a net flight of over 40,000 people. They are running from crushing costs. The median home price hovers near $420,000, swallowing over a third of the average household's income. Baltimore, once an industrial titan, is now a shadow of its former self, with neighborhoods where 1 in 5 adults is jobless. The city's port has lost thousands of jobs, and the steel mills are long silent. Crime has become a part of the city's identity, with over 330 homicides in 2023, making it one of America's deadliest cities. Businesses have retreated, leaving behind hollowed-out city blocks. Meanwhile, residents are suffocated by some of the highest income and electricity taxes in the nation. The state presents a fantasy of wealthy D.C. suburbs, but the reality for most is collapsing cities and forgotten towns. The source of Maryland's collapse is hiding in plain sight: its dangerous over-reliance on the federal government. For decades, the state's economy has been artificially inflated by a government bubble. Its prosperity was not built on diverse industries, but on the high salaries of federal employees and the massive contracts flowing into the D.C. suburbs. This created a tale of two states: a wealthy, insulated corridor of government workers, and the rest of Maryland, which was left behind. As federal spending tightens and political priorities shift, that bubble is now bursting. The state has no economic plan B. The second root cause is the systemic failure to transition its legacy cities. Baltimore's decline wasn't sudden. It was a slow burn that started when its manufacturing and steel industries died. Instead of fostering new industries, the city became increasingly dependent on government subsidies, which only masked the deeper economic rot. There was no real strategy for diversification. Maryland's economy wasn't built on a solid foundation of private enterprise, but on the shifting sands of federal politics. Now, as those sands shift, the entire structure is beginning to crumble. Number 8. Massachusetts. Massachusetts, the so-called brain of America, is losing its mind. Home to Harvard and MIT, the state is ironically watching its own talent flee. Over 50,000 residents have left since 2020. They are escaping an economy that has become simply unlivable. The median home price is a staggering $585,000. Rents in Boston can easily top $3,000 a month. Property taxes are among the highest in the nation. The state's pride in tech and healthcare has been shattered by widespread layoffs while hospitals drown in debt. Entrepreneurs and high earners are packing up for Florida and Texas, driven away by brutal taxes. Even keeping the lights on has become a luxury, with electricity bills jumping 30% in just 2 years. Massachusetts may boast Ivy League prestige, but it has become a fortress that only the ultra-rich can afford to live in. Everyone else is being priced out of their own future. The decline of Massachusetts is a self-inflicted wound, born from a combination of policy arrogance and economic reality. The first major driver was the implementation of the millionaire's tax, a 9% levy on high earners. While sold as a way to fund public services, its real-world effect was to trigger a capital flight. Entrepreneurs, investors, and the very biotech firms that once defined the state's innovation economy saw the writing on the wall and began moving their assets and jobs to more business-friendly states. It was a classic case of a government killing the golden goose. The second root cause is the state's brain drain paradox. Massachusetts is perhaps the world's greatest engine for attracting intellectual talent. Universities like Harvard and MIT draw in the brightest minds, but the state's own policies ensure they cannot stay. Crippling housing costs and a lack of middle-class opportunities mean that recent graduates are forced to take their world-class education elsewhere. The state has effectively become a high-cost training ground for other economies. It invests in producing the best and brightest, only to watch them leave, unable to afford the cost of living in the very place that educated them. Number 7. Ohio. Ohio, once the heart of American industrial might, is now collapsing like a rusted-out factory. The state's population has shrunk by nearly 60,000 people since 2020. The cheap homes, with a median price of just $205,000, are not a bargain. They are a warning sign, a symptom of a state that people are desperate to leave. Wages have stagnated for decades, while its industrial base has been completely gutted. Steel plants in Cleveland and Youngstown that once supported entire communities now stand as silent monuments to a lost era. Over 35% of the state's manufacturing jobs have vanished since the year 2000. In their place are low-wage service jobs that offer no career and no hope. Cities are crumbling, with downtown vacancy rates in Cleveland hitting 30%, and a devastating opioid crisis, born from economic despair, has claimed thousands of lives, leaving a scar on every community. Ohio isn't just in decline, it's a cautionary tale of what happens when an entire way of life dies. Ohio's collapse was set in motion decades ago, engineered by a globalist economic agenda that treated its workers as disposable. The first shockwave was the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. This policy actively encouraged auto and steel manufacturers to move their factories to Mexico, where labor was cheaper. For cities like Youngstown and Toledo, this was an economic death sentence. The deal dismantled the state's industrial backbone, job by job, factory by factory. But the final blow was the decision to allow China to join the World Trade Organization. This unleashed a tidal wave of competition that Ohio's remaining industries simply could not withstand. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a slaughter. The result of these policies was not just economic devastation. It created a social vacuum. The loss of jobs and community purpose led to a widespread sense of hopelessness, which became the fertile ground for the opioid epidemic. The crisis that tore through Ohio wasn't just a public health failure. It was a direct consequence of an economic policy that abandoned an entire generation of American workers. Ohio is the ghost of a globalized America, a state sacrificed for the sake of cheap goods and corporate profits. Number 6. Louisiana. Louisiana is sinking, and not just into the rising waters of the Gulf. The state is a disaster zone of poverty, corruption, and systemic failure. Nearly 45,000 residents have fled since 2020, escaping an economy stuck in quicksand. Nearly 1 in 5 residents lives in poverty, double the national average. New Orleans has earned the grim title of America's murder capital, with a homicide rate higher than any other major city. Businesses have abandoned the city's core, leaving it gutted. Homeowners face a crisis of their own, with insurance premiums skyrocketing by as much as 300% after major insurers fled the hurricane-ravaged coast. The state's economic backbone, the oil and gas industry, has shed tens of thousands of jobs. The schools are failing. The roads are cratered. Louisiana is collapsing on every front, a slow-motion disaster trapping those who cannot afford to escape. The tragedy of Louisiana is that its greatest strength became its fatal weakness. The state is a classic victim of the resource curse. For generations, its economy was built almost entirely on one volatile industry, oil and gas. When energy prices were high, the state prospered, but there was never a serious effort to diversify. The state's leaders failed to invest the oil wealth into education, infrastructure, or new industries. So when the global energy market shifted and oil prices crashed, Louisiana had nothing to fall back on. Its entire economic model was a house of cards, and the wind had just changed direction. This economic vulnerability was compounded by decades of environmental mismanagement. The very industry that funded the state was also destroying the coastal wetlands that protected it from hurricanes. Instead of using its resources to fortify the coastline, the state allowed critical ecosystems to be eroded. This policy failure led directly to the insurance crisis we see today. As the natural storm barriers disappeared, the risk of catastrophic flooding grew, forcing insurers to flee and leaving homeowners with unpayable premiums. Louisiana's fate was sealed by a short-sighted dependence on a single industry and a reckless disregard for the very environment that sustained it. Number 5, Michigan. Michigan is collapsing under the weight of its own industrial ghosts. The former heart of the American auto industry is now bleeding residents, jobs, and hope. Over 60,000 people have left since 2024. Detroit, once a symbol of American prosperity, leads the exodus. The city's homeowners pay some of the highest effective property tax rates in the entire country. The job market is an industrial graveyard. Michigan has lost 350,000 manufacturing jobs since the year 2000, and they are never coming back. The big three automakers now outsource parts and labor overseas. The electric vehicle revolution, which was supposed to be Michigan's salvation, has instead brought more automation, leaving human workers behind. In Detroit, nearly 20% of all homes are vacant or condemned. Entire blocks have been reclaimed by nature. The state's infrastructure is crumbling, with thousands of roads and bridges in poor condition. Michigan is a stark warning of what happens when an industrial giant fails to adapt to a changing world. Michigan's collapse is a story of profound corporate and political complacency. The first failure belongs to the big three automakers themselves. For decades, Ford, GM, and Chrysler dominated the market with a sense of invincibility. They grew slow, inefficient, and were completely unprepared for the wave of more reliable, fuel-efficient vehicles coming from Japan and Europe in the 1980s and 90s. Instead of innovating, they relied on political protection, which only delayed the inevitable decline. By the time they were forced into bankruptcy and bailouts, an entire generation of manufacturing jobs had already been lost. The second failure is happening right now, disguised as progress. The promised salvation of the electric vehicle revolution has turned out to be a hollow promise for Michigan's workforce. While billions are being invested in new EV plants, these facilities are models of hyper-automation. They employ far fewer workers than the traditional assembly plants they are replacing. The state's leaders celebrated the investment but ignored the human cost. They failed to secure a future for the blue-collar workers who built the state. Michigan didn't learn from its first collapse. It is now overseeing a second one, trading human jobs for robotic efficiency and calling it the future. Number 4. New Mexico. New Mexico is collapsing in silence. The state is losing its youth and its future, as over 30,000 residents have packed up for Texas and Arizona since 2020. They are fleeing a state trapped in a cycle of poverty, with nearly 19% of the population living below the poverty line. Crime is consuming its largest city, Albuquerque, which now ranks as one of the most dangerous metros in America. The constant theft has made it impossible for small businesses to survive. The job market is stagnant. The state is facing a severe shortage of teachers and healthcare workers, crippling its schools and closing rural hospitals. Some counties no longer have maternity wards, forcing pregnant women to drive hundreds of miles for basic care. The land of enchantment has become the land of exodus. It is a state bleeding out its most valuable resource, its people. The tragedy of New Mexico is that its poverty is a choice, a result of profound government malpractice. The state is not poor. In fact, it is sitting on a sea of black gold. The Permian Basin oil fields generate billions of dollars in revenue for the state government every single year. But that money is not being invested back into the people. This is the state's root cause of failure, a catastrophic mismanagement of its own wealth. Instead of using the oil revenues to build world-class schools, modern hospitals, and diversified economic opportunities, the money often gets lost in a bloated state bureaucracy or spent on short-sighted projects. This failure to invest in human capital has created a systemic brain drain. Why would a young, educated person stay in a state with failing schools, limited health care, and few high-paying jobs outside of the volatile oil sector? They don't. They graduate and they leave. This creates a vicious cycle. As the best and brightest depart, the state's workforce becomes less skilled, making it even harder to attract new industries. New Mexico is not collapsing because it lacks resources. It is collapsing because its leaders have failed to use those resources to build a future for their own citizens. Number 3. Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, the Keystone State, is cracking under the pressure of its own history. Once the industrial backbone of the nation, it is now losing its people and its purpose. The state has lost over 65,000 residents since 2020. They are fleeing from a state where the jobs of the past are gone and the jobs of the future have not arrived. The steel empire is dead. Cities like Pittsburgh and Bethlehem, which once built America, are now hollowed-out shells. Over 300,000 manufacturing jobs have been lost since 2000. The so-called replacement jobs in logistics and warehousing pay poverty wages. Philadelphia, its largest city, is trapped in a nightmare of crime and drugs, with over 400 homicides in 2023. Meanwhile, the state itself is physically crumbling. More than 15% of its bridges are structurally deficient. The state that once held the nation together is now struggling to hold itself up. Pennsylvania's decline is the story of a state being crushed by the financial weight of its own past. The first root cause is its massive infrastructure debt. The state is home to some of the oldest roads, bridges, and water systems in the country, many built during its industrial heyday a century ago. The cost to maintain this decaying infrastructure is astronomical, consuming billions of dollars from the state budget each year. This leaves little to no money for investments in the future, like modernizing the electrical grid or expanding broadband internet to rural areas. The state is trapped in a permanent state of repair, unable to build anything new. This physical decay is mirrored by political paralysis. Pennsylvania is a deeply divided state with a stark cultural and economic split between its major cities and its vast rural areas. This political trench warfare has made it impossible to pass any meaningful, long-term economic strategy. Democrats in Philadelphia and Republicans in the countryside are often locked in a zero-sum game, blocking projects and investments that could benefit the entire state. Without a unified vision, Pennsylvania is unable to move forward. It is a state held hostage by its aging infrastructure and its political divisions, slowly crumbling from within. Number 2, Illinois. Illinois is in a state of fiscal freefall. The population decline is staggering, with over 200,000 residents fleeing since 2020, the second worst exodus in the nation. They are escaping a state that has become financially toxic. Property taxes are the second highest in America, suffocating homeowners. Chicago is battling a shocking crime wave with 700 homicides in 2023. The business climate is so hostile that major corporations like Boeing, Caterpillar, and Tyson Foods have all moved their headquarters out of the state, taking thousands of high-paying jobs with them. Downtown Chicago, once a vibrant hub of commerce, now has an office vacancy rate of 23%, leaving its iconic skyscrapers dark and empty. Illinois is no longer the land of Lincoln. It has become the land of exodus, crime, and fiscal ruin. The architect of Illinois' collapse is not a mystery. It is a slow-motion disaster that has been unfolding for decades, the state's public pension crisis. This is the root cause of nearly all of its problems. For generations, politicians from both parties made lavish, unaffordable pension promises to public sector unions in exchange for political support. They promised retirement benefits that were wildly out of line with what the private sector offered, and they consistently failed to set aside enough money to pay for them. This created a fiscal time bomb. Today, that bomb has detonated. The state is now on the hook for over $140 billion in unfunded pension liabilities. This is not just a number on a spreadsheet. It is a black hole that is devouring the state's budget. Every year, an ever larger share of taxpayer money is diverted away from essential services like schools, roads, and law enforcement, and is instead funneled into the failing pension system. To cover the shortfall, the state has been forced into a fiscal death spiral. It raises taxes to punishing levels, which drives residents and businesses to leave. This shrinks the tax base, creating an even bigger budget hole, which then forces another round of tax hikes. It is a self-reinforcing cycle of decline. The corporate exodus from Illinois wasn't a surprise. It was a rational business decision in the face of a state that is collapsing under the weight of its own irresponsible promises. Number 1, West Virginia. At number 1, we find America's ground zero for collapse, West Virginia. The state is dying. It has lost over 40,000 residents since 2020, and the bleeding is accelerating. The median household income is a meager $52,000. Nearly 17% of the population lives in poverty. The coal industry, which once gave the state its identity and its livelihood, is gone. Tens of thousands of jobs have evaporated, leaving behind hollowed-out towns where unemployment is rampant. There are no replacement industries. The state's GDP growth has lagged the nation for a decade. Its healthcare system is in ruins, rural hospitals are closing, and it has the highest opioid overdose death rate in the country. Entire communities are being raised by grandparents because the parents have been lost to addiction. The state is facing such a severe brain drain that its universities are reporting enrollment declines of 30%. West Virginia isn't just collapsing, it has been abandoned. A state once called almost heaven has become a portrait of American hell. West Virginia's collapse is the most tragic on this list because it was not just a failure of local policy, but a deliberate sacrifice made at the national level. The state is a casualty of America's national energy policy. For 20 years, a bipartisan consensus in Washington, D.C. waged a war on coal. Driven by environmental concerns, federal regulations like the Clean Power Plan were designed to make coal energy so expensive and difficult to produce that it would be forced out of the market. These policies worked, but while the rest of the country benefited from cheaper natural gas and cleaner air, West Virginia's economy was systematically dismantled. There was no just transition, There was no federal plan to help the state build a new economy. The workers and communities that had powered America for a century were simply left behind, treated as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of a national agenda. This economic abandonment created the conditions for the state's second crisis, the opioid epidemic. The widespread hopelessness and lack of opportunity made the population uniquely vulnerable to the flood of prescription painkillers that pharmaceutical companies pumped into the state. West Virginia's health crisis is inextricably linked to its economic one. The state wasn't just neglected, it was actively sacrificed. It is the starkest example of what happens when a region's primary industry is targeted for elimination and its people are forgotten. The stories of these 10 states are not isolated incidents. They are chapters in a much larger story about the decline of a nation. When you connect the dots, a clear and repeatable blueprint for failure emerges. It begins with short-sighted policy decisions, often made for political gain. It continues with an over-reliance on a single industry, whether it's government spending in Maryland or coal in West Virginia. It's fueled by the accumulation of debt, whether it's crumbling infrastructure in Pennsylvania or an impossible pension burden in Illinois. And it always ends with the erosion of the working and middle classes, who are ultimately forced to flee. The collapse of these states was not random. It was not an accident. It was the predictable outcome of a system that has repeatedly prioritized short-term benefits over long-term stability. These states are the canaries in the coal mine, warning us of a systemic rot that runs much deeper. So the final question we must ask is this: if this is the blueprint for how a state fails, what does it tell us about the future of the nation itself?